Let me first of all ask you all, in terms of your familiarity with FDA, what FDA's mission actually is. Can anybody volunteer that information? All right. So the mission is to protect and promote the public health, right? So protect and advance the public health. And FDA has oversight or regulatory authority with respect to drugs and food, right? You got your food and drugs in the title, medical devices and biologic products as well. So the interesting thing about it is that when we're talking about safety and effectiveness, which is the standard by which FDA will enable different products, medical products, to come on the market, the question becomes, so where does really cybersecurity come into the picture here? And you might be interested in knowing that actually there is no, with regard to the statutory language within the Food and Drug Act or any subsequent acts, there is no actual call-out for cybersecurity within the medical product arena and FDA's jurisdiction. So folks questioned several years ago when we started to encounter a lot of interest and researchers were coming to us with vulnerabilities, for example, that they identified in medical technologies and medical devices. The question came to us through other government partners and through the administration as well as, does FDA have sufficient even authorities as is to be able to regulate and consider cybersecurity within the realm of its mission, again, of protecting and promoting the public health. So what I'm going to provide to you is kind of our journey over the past few years, really since I would say 2013 marks a significant point in time that from there and beyond to where we are at present, there's been a lot of focus within our center. I'm at FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health on building a cybersecurity program with respect to medical devices. And I would anticipate that that will also continue to diffuse in terms of other areas, other product centers, and across FDA as well, since areas of cybersecurity concern more than simply medical devices. All right, just with that introduction, what I wanted to say as well is that I would like to keep this discussion more engaging and more interactive, and so I would welcome any questions or comments that you may have throughout this talk to just kind of step up to the microphone and ask them so that I don't lose you and so that I keep you, engaged in what really you want to hear. It's no secret there's been a lot of attention in the media over the past few years. There's been a lot of evidence that when we talk about, as Susan mentioned, infrastructure, critical infrastructure being attacked, that among the areas of critical infrastructure being attacked, the healthcare and public health sector, which is one of the 16 deemed sectors of critical infrastructure, has been under a fair amount of attack, whether it's through the ransomware attacks on various hospitals. We saw a global evidence of this, a global campaign through WannaCry that while it may not have targeted hospitals and healthcare systems, they certainly were impacted, more so in the UK in NHS, but we did see evidence of that in the United States as well with respect to certain hospitals where imaging equipment was affected. And so we, in terms of thinking about medical device cybersecurity, have really tried to change the culture across the healthcare public health environment. And frankly speaking, a lot of this meant going back again to 2013, 2014, creating and heightening that situational awareness for healthcare provider organizations, for medical device manufacturers especially so, as far as the necessity to build security into new products and to assure also that devices that are already being in use, that are already on the market, that are already deployed within hospitals, that there is a mechanism and a management program that is in place throughout the lifetime of that device to continue monitoring for and improving and enhancing the security of those devices. What you'll hear, and what you probably have heard already, is that we're dealing with probably one of the biggest challenges is that legacy drag. The legacy devices that often represent a lot of capital equipment within hospitals, your MRIs, your CT scans, and other types of equipment, which are significant investments that healthcare organizations make with the intent that those devices will remain in place for a decade or longer because they're clinically usable and they're providing that kind of utility. And yet, going back that number of years, those devices would not have had or may not have had the necessary security built into those devices. So with a bit of a conundrum here, because there's recognition in terms of these devices, first of all, sitting on old operating systems, that they were not built with, some of them, the capability of easily patching or updating, and yet while the manufacturers are in a position to now provide much more secure devices in new development, hospitals and healthcare organizations are not necessarily in the position to make those kinds of investments to procure new devices. So just kind of a taste on that. So when we talk about devices, yes, it's your standard CIA confidentiality, integrity, and availability with regard to data. No question about that. It's important in terms of the data that's transferred from a device that provides often information that a physician or provider is going to need to utilize or to rely on in order to deliver or make a decision around an intervention. So the integrity of that data, the availability of that data becomes really particularly important. But I would go beyond that. You know, we're very concerned at FDA with respect to that, again, that cyber physical element, that element of how might a hack to a device, how might an exploit of vulnerabilities in a device actually impact on that device's functionality, its intended, its performance, its ability to function the way it is supposed to, whether it's with respect to diagnosing or whether it's with respect to delivering a certain type of intervention. So what's been our bottom line up front? So again, going back several years ago with recognition that FDA absolutely cannot do this alone in terms of what would come down to a significant change in culture across the medical device ecosystem, across the healthcare community, and that it really warrants bringing the whole of the community together, and that starting from a place of we're not enemies or adversaries here. We shouldn't be confrontational. We really need to be able to work this problem set or these complex problem sets together, whether we're talking about the healthcare providers, whether we're talking about medical device manufacturers, whether it's the government, whether it's patients and security researchers and others, that there is absolutely a need for bringing that entire organism, if you will, together. Part of what became very clear in this journey that we've had and that we're still tackling is this need for shifting the mindset within organizations. And what I mean by that, again, is in informing and educating and working with medical device manufacturers to begin with, this notion that, well, we build our devices so that they deliver that intended use. And when we do the different types of management on our devices in its development phase, we're not necessarily thinking about the potential adversary and the adversary's capability of being able to hack into the device. So it became really important for us at the agency to explain to manufacturers, and in that we also issued guidance in 2014, that no, actually, as you work on your development of new devices, you absolutely need to be thinking about the potential for a device to be used in a way that perhaps was not part of, again, the intended use or labeling. And that means really shifting the mindset to thinking about threat modeling. This becomes really important, and the next point as well, around not using probabilistic determinations when we're speaking and when we're engaging with a clinical audience, because what we find is that, and I can speak to this myself as a physician, physicians at large, are thinking about the use of devices and other interventions purely in the realm of the benefit to humankind, right? When one goes into a hospital, we're thinking about not that the hospital can be in some ways a hostile environment that's under attack, which many of them are, but rather the physician's thinking about, purely the benefits that these devices are providing. And so from the standpoint of the physician's mindset when approaching a patient and having to make a decision and thinking around what we call that benefit-risk calculus, the physician is often used to simply thinking about what the data shows, what the evidence demonstrates, that where is the precedent for these kinds of exploits or potential hacks having occurred that then lead me to probabilistically thinking about the likelihood of something happening to this patient, and therefore defaulting off into a position of, well, the benefits will always outweigh the risks of these devices. So, certainty on one side with regard to what the benefits of many devices are, but a lot of the real asymmetry of information in terms of uncertainty and not knowing how to kind of think about that with regard to the potential exploitability of devices and what will happen there. So a great need for education and really engagement with the clinical audience in this regard. Just a picture of many of the stakeholders that we continue to engage, and there are more, but as you can imagine, it's pretty broad. And within any one of these circles, you have nested a lot of other particular smaller groups. Within healthcare providers alone, we're talking about within any one hospital. Is it your biomedical or clinical engineering team? Is it the IT team? Is it the clinicians? The providers, the physicians, the nurses. So they are, and often in a lot of these groups, there's a fair amount of stovepiping and siloing as well. And while, what we will engage, and while it's important to engage with the hospital as a whole, it's so critical for us to be able to also make sure that everyone who is part of that team has awareness and is kind of rowing in the same direction. So going back a few years ago, and this goes back to the prior administration as well as the current administration, as we've thought about what that conceptual framework is for cybersecurity, where we certainly borrowed from the prior executive orders as well as the NIST framework for improvement of critical infrastructure cybersecurity, and utilized that NIST framework and its 5 core functions, the core functions that were identified as identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, as that framework upon which to translate what our expectations were of medical device manufacturers as well. And so as we developed both our expectations on the pre-market side for devices that would be coming on the market, as well as on the post-market side for devices that, again, are in use, where vulnerabilities will continue to emerge over the lifetime of that device, we took those 5 core functions and mapped what our expectations were so that manufacturers could have a deeper grasp or understanding of what it is that we need to see before we are going to allow a new product on the market, or under what circumstances or situations do we state that a device that's out there presently in use with certain vulnerabilities represents a significant risk, what we would call an uncontrolled risk to harm, to patient harm. Just a trajectory of our journey to date. Again, although there were certain guidances and statements and communications that we've issued well before 2013, I don't want to say that we just woke up in 2013. Going back into 2005 and 2009, there were prior guidances, but in terms of the bulk of really setting up a more holistic program, that starts in 2013 and, as you could see, continues forward into the present. A lot of our work has focused on, again, release of guidance, release of policy, guidances around cybersecurity of medical devices, issuing safety communications with respect to vulnerabilities that have been identified by researchers or researchers working with manufacturers, where specific instructions and recommendations need to be provided to the end user, to physicians, to patients, to the public. Convening public workshops on this topic area as it continues to evolve. Establishing a working group internally within our organization of subject matter experts that really crosses the entire product life cycle, and coordinating very closely with our fellow government partners such as Department of Homeland Security. And if anything that you take out of this, it's really been very much a evolutionary process, and one where we are trying to mature ourselves at FDA as well as mature the ecosystem together. And to that point, we just released in April of 2018 a medical device safety action plan, which highlighted in a specific section what further steps we are anticipating right now this year in terms of advancing medical device cybersecurity, and I'll go into that a little bit further later on. So what, again, have we released thus far that really kind of gives that total product life cycle, that TPLC approach? Pre-market guidance, post-market guidance, as you can see here. We have an outward-facing cybersecurity webpage that we continue to update with more information as we develop more particular work products. We also issued last year what we call our Fda Fact Sheet, or what I like to call our myth-busting, dispelling myths sheet, because we were hearing a lot of this urban legend in terms of FDA doesn't permit medical device manufacturers to update devices for cybersecurity without having to come back to FDA with new submissions for review, and that is a burden and that takes a lot of time. So that is a total myth. That is not the case. I state that verbally all the time when I speak. It's in our guidances as well. It's very, very clear that in enhancing, in strengthening and advancing the state of cybersecurity of medical devices, we want manufacturers to get out there proactively and patch and update their devices and their systems. Absolutely, they need to go through the appropriate internal testing, verification, and validation, but they do not need to come back to the agency for, quote unquote, a recertification of their devices. So anything that we can do to basically remove ourselves as impediments to a process of advancing the state, the posture of cybersecurity, we are looking to do. Again, and that brings us kind of to the approach that we use within our guidances. These are just the principles of the pre-market approach, the pre-market guidance, which speaks to the fact that, and this comes back to what I was saying at the beginning, it's not called out in statute, right, cybersecurity. But what we do is, utilizing the current framework, the current legal framework and the regulatory framework, we leverage existing regulations and interpret them from a policy perspective to be inclusive of cybersecurity. And so in this case, for cybersecurity medical devices, we're leveraging very much what's called the QSR, the Quality Systems Regulation. And utilizing that, we are able, so this is an important point, we are able to keep devices from going on the market if we're not seeing acceptable cybersecurity built into those devices during the time of review. Let me ask a quick question of this group. Does anybody, and this is not just medical devices, but across how FDA works, does FDA test products before they go on the market? No. That's correct. No. Okay, so I think that that's often a misunderstanding that the public has in terms of how FDA operates. It has to be, first of all, an implicit trust relationship that what the developer, whether it's a drug manufacturer, biologics, medical devices, what they are providing to the agency for review is a paper review. And that what they are providing is accurate, that it is trustworthy, and that the testing and everything that they've provided, again, that there's integrity there. We do not test drugs. We do not test medical devices. So, and this question has come up a lot on the security side. Why doesn't FDA just go ahead and test the security of these devices? So I would answer to that as, well, we don't test for biocompatibility. We don't test for sterility. We don't bring these products into the agency to test them. That is different from how other regulatory agencies outside the U.S. work in certain circumstances where there are other bodies that work together with the regulator that do formal testing, and then that information, because it's recognized, is part of the approval process to get a product on the market. Go ahead.
Just as a question for clarification.
Mm-hmm.
The testing that you ask or require manufacturers to submit does not require independent third-party testing, correct? Or an IVR?
You're talking about in general, or for cybersecurity?
Well, let's say for but we're talking about cybersecurity, so maybe we could be specifically about that. But I think that's the case generally, too.
That is true, although most manufacturers will take that higher standard of an independent third-party testing lab. That's a certified lab in general, because they know, because our recognizing that certification and that the testing methods that have been utilized and that the laboratory is meeting certain established criteria or specs means that for the standpoint of review, it's going to enable that review to be a Sure. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, Rick Farrow. So we just had the incident with Medtronic, where you could break into their pacemaker and defibrillator device reader and writers. So has any manufacturer's product ever been refused for cybersecurity reason, or disallowed for a cybersecurity reason?
The answer is yes. Products have been refused. I would say, first of all, again, the Medtronic example, which was presented last week at Black Hat. I was there. And has gotten a lot of attention. So there's an example of another legacy device, correct? So those are devices that were implanted and that were developed years ago.
Actually, the device was the box that the
programmer
technician would use to program.
The programmer.
Yeah, maybe that's also legacy. I'm not sure.
That is, yes. And so we are working, I will say publicly that we have been working with the manufacturer in terms of addressing these issues. But to your question regarding new devices, new submissions that have been coming in, again, since the pre-market guidance was issued, yes, we are asking for certain information, looking at the material and the information that's come in, and there have been cases where we have gone back to the manufacturer and said, this isn't good enough, you'll have to do X, Y, and Z before we're ready to allow that product to go on the market. And if you ask manufacturers that now, they'll tell you, yes, that is the case, and more so. I would also add that we are in the process right now of even updating what was that original 2014 pre-market guidance to raise the bar even further based upon a lot of the observations and learnings that we've had over the past several years, whether, again, it's more of the, the global campaigns, WannaCry, NotPetya, or whether it's some of the examples of the vulnerabilities that we've seen that have been brought out publicly, the St. Jude Abbott pacemakers and ICDs, the Medtronic cases, some of the others as well. So there's, stay tuned in terms of what you will see in terms of additional rigor or expectations, but that is our stance.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I really wanted to hear that word. Yes, we have said
yes.
No. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There's a number of other fields where people are concerned about patch lifetime, things like electricity substation equipment or cars. Some car makers would like autonomous vehicles to retire after 6 years, but we have laws in Europe, for example, saying that you have to provide mechanical spare parts for 10 years after the last car was sold. And so it looks likely that car vendors will be compelled to make patch support available for 10 years. This is causing alarm because it will cost them. Tell me, are there any plans or prospects for putting a requirement on somebody who sells a $10 million MRI machine that they must undertake to patch the device for 15 years?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And first of all, I appreciate also a lot of the analogies with the automotive industry. We find ourselves working across also the automotive industry and automotive regulators here because of many of those similarities. So with regard to what potential requirements may be up and coming, as we put out in our safety action plan, and I have a slide on that a little bit later. Actually, let me just see if I could skip to that. All right. Yeah. So there were several things that we called out specifically in the safety action plan. In addition to updating the guidance, excuse me, it is about potentially seeking additional authorities that would require firms to provide in their submissions even evidence that the device is capable of updates and patches, and that's part of our review process. I can say at this point that we would say for X number of years. I think that that's something that as part of even a request for additional authorities, this will be discussed with the ecosystem, and there'll be a lot of debate around what does that look like. But to see that we're thinking about it, absolutely.
Thanks.
The patchability updatability is a core component of also what's going into the updated guidance as well, because we absolutely do not want to be in the situation where we were a year ago, where manufacturers have indicated they're not able to patch or update certain devices.
Thanks.
Continuing the previous question, what happens if a company goes under or get acquired or something? And okay, so it supplies physical spare parts you can take care of, but patches would be pretty difficult to handle. Do we have any regulation, anything to assure that the equipment?
Yeah, that's a very important question as well. So I would be incorrect to say, oh yeah, we've got all this really worked out already. These are very tough problems and challenges that we're talking about and working through with the community. But with regard, first of all, to companies where there's an acquisition. So number one, I think a lot of medical device manufacturers face that right now, where they're recognizing that while they're making an acquisition, have they really looked at some of the technical debt that they're acquiring in terms of there being a real disparity, perhaps, in terms of the security within devices and the product portfolio of the company that's being acquired that now they are responsible for, but they are responsible for it. So the acquisition piece, I think, is somewhat more straightforward. I think the bigger issue is around, company that goes out of business and devices that are even by a company considered to be already end of life, no longer supported, but the hospital or healthcare organization, is willing to take that chance and continue to use them. So, who's responsible? What happens in this scenario? And that's a very tough nut to crack right now. I would say that we have been working together as part of an effort that was put on the Department of Health and Human Services through an act in 2015 called CISA to set up a task force, first of all, that was going to examine through the landscape what are some of these really tough issues. First of all, identify what the issues are, do a thorough deep dive into them, and then perhaps come up with some recommendations as to what can be done. That was one of the challenges that was brought forward. So coming out of that, there is another task group that consists of manufacturers working together with healthcare organizations and government to try to determine how would we deal with that? What might that security plan or roadmap look like? And part of that also means addressing the concept of the software bill of materials in terms of understanding and being transparent around the component parts that may be in some of these devices so that one can map them to existing or known vulnerabilities. In this way, healthcare organizations that are going to maintain devices in place that may no longer be supported, at least that they have awareness of what's residing on their systems and that they're able to proactively address them or at least mitigate risk in the best way that they can possible. So that's another work stream that's happening as well. I think I talk about development of software bill of materials here as another area that we are working through in terms of making potentially an additional requirement, but in the meantime, voluntarily, manufacturers are working together with healthcare organizations to try to define the scope of that and what that could look like.
Hi, Cynthia Irvin, Naval Postgraduate School, but not speaking for the Navy. In the world of medical devices and just medical things in general, we have, for example, on drugs, expiry dates. And there are things that people bring into their homes, drugs and devices. Do you anticipate that some sorts of devices, perhaps that are more like consumer products, would have expiry dates on them so that the consumer has to go out and get a new device that might have better cybersecurity mechanisms in them as things progress?
So I think that I can't give you an answer for sure on that, obviously. In terms of a projection, I would say that consumer devices are more likely to undergo anyway those iterations more rapidly, and because their costs are going to be lower than, again, a piece of capital equipment. I don't know that that's as big of a challenge area as it is where the question comes up around expiry of medical devices, of infusion pumps, of dialysis machines, of ventilators, of really bigger pieces of equipment. I don't think that, whereas you do have within the drug side expiration dates and shelf life and testing of that nature, that's still heavily debated on the medical device side. And so, certainly in the near term, you're not going to see an expiration on it. But with respect to where there are levers, where things are happening, is more so on the front end in terms of contract language, procurement language between a manufacturer and a customer, particularly, again, an institutional customer, of understanding up front what the terms are with regard to the support of that device, and that there's an agreement to that period of time where that device is going to be supported.
I think you just kind of addressed this, but I was going to make the point that you've been talking a lot about manufacture and dealing with support. There's the side of the medical provider using devices that are no longer being supported. And how do you address what are you thinking about that, or how are you addressing that?
The medical provider, the physician?
Yeah, the hospital, the clinic, the medical provider, that they're using a device which is the manufacturer, say they've gone out of business and there's no support for it.
Right. Yeah, that falls under really the risk management or risk assessment within the hospital to make that kind of a decision. Once something is no longer supported, in terms of whether there are sufficient controls that the hospital feels can be put in place in order to better protect that particular device. But again, I think this is where, with newer devices that are being purchased, that can be made a lot clearer through, again, efforts happening around contract language that institutions are much more savvy to now before they will go ahead and purchase a device. And a lot of the hospitals now are working together through group purchasing organizations to really negotiate that as a, kind of a force to be reckoned with, as opposed to an individual facility trying to, work that through with a medical device manufacturer. So, they're able to scale in that regard.
But does the FDA provide guidance to medical providers on how they should be thinking about that?
So the guidance that we put out, which is to industry, which is clearly to our regulated industry, also informs, it should be read by healthcare providers, and our recommendations are that both the healthcare provider organization work very closely with the manufacturer in terms of the ability to provide further updates and patches beyond the time period that the manufacturer is willing to do so. How might one go about doing that, or what does that look like?
Okay, that's great. The other thing I thought I'd bring up is I hear the rhetoric that's often, the phrases, things like hospitals and so on are used around healthcare providers, but as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of small clinics which, a specialist, some medical assistants, right? They're not going to have the resources and the expertise often to do those sorts of analyses, nor the leverage with the provider, the equipment providers.
And that's an area where, with respect to the effort that we talked about, the Healthcare Cybersecurity Task Force that came out of CISA 2015 to try to make sure that there were representation on that task force of more of the specialty clinics or the small, making sure that voice is heard and that the challenges that those types of practices face. It's not as though they're going to have even a CISO within their practice. They're not going to have someone who's going to have that level of awareness. And so there represents real gap around information and also how to best work with the vendor, the manufacturer in those circumstances. There are going to be more work products coming out of this group that will address some of these questions, but I think that a lot of this is going to be maturity and evolution.
Yeah, so the example I like to give, my partner's in her fourth year of rotations, and she was at a clinic where the doctor running the clinic doesn't even do email. Right. So their level of understanding of device issues is completely lacking.
Oh, I know. I've been to my own, a few years ago, I went for my own personal visit to my physician, and she was asking me what some of the things I'm engaged with, and I mentioned to her at that time cybersecurity of medical devices, and here this is an individual who serves on an IRB of a major university hospital, and looked at me like, what am I talking about? And I said, look around your office, look at all these equipment and everything. So there's, when I talk about really being able to meet people and stakeholders where they are, where they presently are and begin to educate them and bring them on board and understand what their pain points are and how we have to kind of bring everyone. People are at different levels here of understanding and awareness, and thankfully we have some real champions who can help partner with and who have been very gracious in being willing to help others. And that's a start, but it's going to take more time. Yes?
Thanks. Simpson Garfinkel again. So the problems that you're facing are not all that different from the problems that every other industry that uses computers is facing. And it seems that every industry is developing its own expertise and coming up with very different plans. And does that make sense to you, or do you think you should be working with all the other different agencies that are trying to address these kinds of issues?
So we do work across the different agencies. There are several efforts that bring the different government agencies together on this for us to be able to dialogue and express some of the difficulties we may be having so that we can learn from another sector what they're doing, why they're doing it that way, what they've observed. For some things, healthcare and public health as a safety critical sector is different than finance. That stakes are a lot higher, right? When you think about different kinds of potentials for remote and multi-scaled, multi-patient scaled attacks, it's a bit different. But we do work across industries and share those kinds of practices and guidances, and I think that that's been very useful for us over the past few years. So I had a couple of additional slides, and I will make the slides available for anyone to to take a look at as well. We've got a lot of exciting things happening on the FDA side on the preparedness and response piece as well, in terms of trying to fill a gap around how does a healthcare organization respond if they are under some type of an attack and their devices are no longer working. Well, there's nothing out there. So we've been working on playbooks for that and working on exercises for that. And a lot of what we've been doing is really trying to create public-private types of partnerships to help address some of the gap areas that we've identified around understanding vulnerabilities, analyzing them within the construct of a clinical environment or a simulated clinical environment, which is quite different than somebody working on a device that they've procured over eBay and are working on in their garage. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and yes, and again, working across government agencies and working across the department as well. I will end here. I mean, this has been great for me, just having the opportunity to speak with you all, and I'm glad that people got up to ask questions in the middle or offer comment. I can hang around a little bit longer if people want to speak further. Thank you.